Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are all well aware of everything that Donald Trump has had to deal with in his journey to this point. Everything that's in the past, we are well aware of, all the attacks on him. But I'm now joined by Bruce Fine, constitutional lawyer, international law expert, to talk about what Donald Trump needs to do in the future moving forward. Bruce, thanks for joining us. This is what's on your mind right now. What Donald Trump needs to do in the future. Tell me, what is the first thing that you think about as far as what Donald Trump needs to do for the future of his presidency?
When I was in the transition from Jimmy Carter into the Reagan administration, in which I served, the most important thing was personnel, to get your people into the high offices, not just at the highest level of the cabinet, but in the second and third tiers, because they run policies. There's 4,100 presidential appointees. And if I were to recommend anything to President Trump, it's that we need to focus on changing the personnel. Right now, all the holdovers are those who basically were working for President Obama for 8 years. That's what you'd expect, right? That's how long he served. And I would suggest to President Trump that he begin at the Department of Justice, which is a major issue. Someone like Judge Napolitano, I think, should be the Deputy Attorney General. Someone like Richard Epstein should be the new Solicitor General. Someone, former Congressman Thomas Campbell, Associate Attorney General. And Jonathan Turley, a professor at George Washington University, should be the head of the Office of Legal Counsel. Those are very critical appointments. At the Defense Department, where the president, you remember, you said it's time to recognize you're president of the United States, not the world. Your obligation is rightly to keep the United States safe from external aggression. Walter Jones, a congressman from North Carolina, who sits on the Armed Services Committee, would be a great Deputy Secretary of Defense to try to end these endless wars that are not defending the American people from attack. They're defending Afghans and Iraqis, those who have no loyalty to us. The troops need to be brought home to the United States to defend us. They need to spend their pay in the United States, not elsewhere, and end the dominance of the military-industrial complex, about which one of your predecessors, Dwight D. Eisenhower, warned. At the State Department, we need a Deputy Secretary of State, Chaz Freeman, just a superb diplomat. He's served long years in many different administrations. And Ron Rotunda, the legal advisor, is someone who would be stellar in understanding international law to keep the United States clean and innocent of any international chaos. Those are examples of the kind of appointments that would bring a team aboard that would prevent much of the disruption, I think, of the policy agenda in the past. But you need to focus on your people foremost, undistracted, if you're going to move forward. Otherwise, you'll be fighting brush fires forever.
Now, Bruce, tell me how you landed on these names. How can Trump make a good, discerning decision on who to look at for future appointees? How did you land on these names, and how can Donald Trump vet or filter the people he looks at in the future as to who to bring on his team?
Well, largely, Owen, it's the fact that when you're in Washington, and I've been there for close to 50 years, yeah, probably too long. I'm part of the swamp that needs to be drained. As you build up circles of people with reputations, you interact with them. They've been involved in government before. Now, he doesn't have to accept these. These are things that they propose, and obviously you want to do your vetting. They're always, the FBI does backgrounds. I don't live in their houses. I don't know everything, but philosophically, these people, I believe, are committed to the kind of lean government, liberty-centered universe, which is, I think, the sentiment that brought President Trump into the White House. And I believe they're all highly qualified in terms of understanding how government works. Remember, the government is a $4.3 trillion enterprise, over 2 million employees, probably 2 million and more contractors. It's not easy to turn around the ship of state. It's like a very large crude carrier. You can't just press the button and stop it. And you need people, if you're going to change the policy, who are very conversant with how this is done. And these people who worked on transition between Carter and Reagan, and I do believe that transition was every bit as much as acute as the difference between Obama and Trump. And I'm highly confident that they would perform superbly. Now, and I do believe, and it's not a fault necessarily of President Trump, that his circles that he dealt with earlier are not people, that maybe one of the reasons got elected, who are highly conversant with how government operates. They know a lot of real estate and business transactions, but that doesn't translate instantly into how things are done in government, because I can guarantee you mathematics, when you're in government, it's not business mathematics. It's way different. It's oftentimes said in politics, 2 + 2 sometimes does equal 5. Sometimes it equals 3. And it just means that the kinds of people and circles that you need to tap to get this talent are different.
Well, yeah, in the private sector, $20 trillion in debt probably doesn't fly, but with the government, here we are. And going back to that ship analogy, one thing you can do is you can try to lighten your load, or perhaps, a smaller ship. Donald Trump had perhaps the smallest team working his campaign from start to finish. Very lean campaign team, very small, kept a lot of things in-house. How can he take that strategy from his campaign and deliver that into the White House? How does he actually make a leaner government? Does he put more onus on people to get the job done, or does he just trim the fat?
Well, I don't know whether it's necessarily calling trimming the fat. I think we have agencies that are redundant. They really do not satisfy the American standard that we pass laws, we create agencies if they are necessary to preserve our liberties. Because after all, the beginning point in our system of government is the opportunity of every individual to develop their faculties and pursue their ambitions free of domestic and external aggression. Other than that, the government's main role is to give them education. But that's it. And we have all sorts of agencies that are totally superfluous to that agenda. And we don't need to be involved in these particular areas. The governments, the local governments can regulate them if they want. The federal government hasn't even been involved. We created the Department of Education 200 years after the founding. Department of Education, in my judgment, should go. If I was to make a recommendation to the president to ease the size of the government, I would abolish Department of Education, Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, a Department of Energy, and take the nuclear requirements and put them in the Defense Department or some other independent agency. Right now it's lodged in the Department of Energy, to the extent that there are essential functions that they can be passed off to other agencies. And this is not revolutionary. During my lifetime, the Interstate Commerce Commission was abandoned after almost 100 years. The Civil Aeronautics Board was abandoned after, I think, about 60 years. So it's not that there can't be life after death with a federal agency, but we need to have a uniform standard that we do not encroach on liberty unless there's a very exacting threshold of need. Not an insurmountable one, but one that's very demanding. After all, that's what government of the people, by the people, for the people means. And that would do marvels with reducing the kinds of distractions and burden that you have running, I say, a $4.3 trillion enterprise. The framers of the Constitution would be literally shocked.
It's funny because we know that throughout this campaign, a lot of what you just said to me is common sense.
Yeah.
A lot of what you just said to me is just very constitutionally based.
Yeah.
We've had people throughout Trump's campaign that have been in his ear saying, Donald, you can't do that. Donald, that's not the way to go about this. Donald, if you say that or do this, these are going to be the consequences. A lot of that, I'm sure you've said, people in his ear have said, no, you can't do that, or you need to be afraid of doing that. Let's say you're in Trump's ear right now. How do you grab Trump's ear, or how does the American people grab Trump's ear and then get him to understand that, hey, you know what, just because in past that hasn't worked in politics, or just because in the past there's been consequences for that, this is a new day. It's time to start trying some of these things like Trump has done and seeing that the American people will actually buy it. How do you get that message to Trump's ear?
I don't know how you necessarily have a direct line into Donald Trump. I certainly do not. I don't suppose most people do. But one of the things, if I was to speak to President Trump, I would say, don't be daunted simply because what you propose is not immediately enacted. Many of the greatest reforms may take a fair amount of time to reach fruition once you get the debate started. Hold hearings, and you have the ability as president to have commissions examining what is the Labor Department doing that's necessary, what is the Commerce Department doing that satisfies this very high demanding standard of need in a democracy that celebrates liberty as its legacy, not going to Mars with government funds or building pyramids and obelisks to nowhere. And that is something that only the president, I think, can put on the agenda the way in which our system operates today and move forward on that score. But it is still very clear, and I know this is true from the reaction of the American people in 2013 to President Obama's request that Congress authorize war against Syria, that the American people phoned in, calls into Congress, went from 3 per day to 100, and Congress balked and said no. So if you can rally the American people to raise that kind of clamor with Congress, Congress will respond. And you still have the bully pulpit, so you have a huge ability to generate that kind of information and calls. I've walked in front of the White House probably thousands of days in my life. I've never seen a big sign out there, please keep the Department of Education or the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor. I don't think they're huge general constituencies for that. These are special interest constituencies that really are one of the reasons why you were elected to president in 2016.
We're all obviously aware of the attacks that have come in the past from the media, the establishment, really from all over the planet even. What can Donald Trump do, or what advice would you give to Trump for perhaps future attacks that might be coming from the media? Obviously, they're not going to stop with the Russian thing. What can Trump do to get ahead of this? Is there anything he can do to try to quell the storm before it approaches?
I think the best way to minimize the attacks or the influence is simply to move forward with policy. The American people care about policy in their lives. The kinds of things that you're discussing, it's an inside the Beltway issue. It's 2 children throwing mud at each other, something like that. Just move forward with your agenda. Don't buy into the name calling. The American people, we're adults. And we have a serious problem. You point out a $20 trillion national debt. And that is at an interest rate that's almost zero. If the historical interest rates on government securities jump to its average historically to about 3.5%, all of our budget would be devoted to spending money to pay off the interest. And we'd have no money for the remainder. And that doesn't require any capital. That's just going to historical norms. The American people are interested in having their very, very loved men and women who are fighting 9 wars that Congress has not declared, not because the American people are immediately jeopardized, but because all these troops can come back and protect us, the borders, our airspace, our sea space, our cyberspace. We need to end these wars unless the president goes to Congress and should say, if you think that our men and women need to risk that last full measure of devotion so Mosul can be in the hands of a Shia government in Iraq, you direct the war. And then if I feel it's wrong, I can veto it, but I'll follow the law if you do it. But that's your responsibility. And in my judgment, that would be, and that would galvanize the focus and the attention of the public debate. These name callings and whether somebody sat on a couch that was, discourteous. I mean, come on. It is almost insulting to think that a conversation as important as the presidency descends to such drivel. But that's what I think is the key here to driving the ability of the media to influence the public debate. Present, you're the one. Focus on the policy, the new names, get your people, because that's ultimately is what the American people will care about. I don't believe the history books are going to recount any of this back and forth right now that's generating all these headlines in the news. It won't even be a
You don't think the
footnote.
picture of Kellyanne Conway on the couch is going to be in the history books?
No, I do not think it will be there with the battlefield at Gettysburg or Omaha Beach or anything like that at all. No.
So, do you think that the GOP has the same vision for the future of America that Donald Trump has? And if not, how does Donald Trump keep the establishment GOP vision from corrupting his vision?
Unfortunately, I believe the GOP doesn't really have much of a vision at all. I think it's basically why Trump was elected, because the Congress, represented by the leadership there, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, they were initially aghast at Donald Trump because he wasn't playing by the norms. And I do believe that, however, that The Congress is ultimately very weak and craven, and the president, I think he's forceful. And again, he needs to be open and public and present it to Congress, have his own people there up there testifying, can keep them responding to his agenda and not the old, same old, same old. I mean, look at right now, for example, the Affordable Health Care Act. You know, I would wager that unless something changes, we'll be with the same statute a year from now. There'll be dawdling and maneuvers around, and it's quite shocking that the Congress, trying to mark up the bill, does it in secret. There's no classified information. The American people has huge amounts of money involved. We're entitled to know what you're talking about and why. Then we can register our views and say, well, call into your member of Congress, write to them. How can you write in? You don't even know what's going on. You know, there are exceptions to everything. Not everything has to be in a fishbowl, but the presumption is transparency unless you make a need for it. Why are you being so secretive about this? What are you hiding?
Well, and speaking about transparency and hiding, you know, Donald Trump is having a lot of people spying on him.
Yeah.
You've got a deep state right now that is trying to undermine his presidency. What can Donald Trump do moving forward to avoid that influence?
I think one thing is in his control, and that is if I were Mr. Trump, I would withdraw. The executive order 12333 is really a license to the intelligence community to spy on anybody and anything that can fall within so-called foreign intelligence, which is a concept that's limitless. We need to have, as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, criminal penalties on anybody who's surveilling except as authorized by statute. That's already on the books. And I do think this executive order, which has been around for many, many years, is something that if he abandoned, that could sharply curtail the kinds of things that are brooding around and publicly debated today. We need to have intelligence, largely military intelligence, but as authorized by statute, not open-ended.
It would appear that Donald Trump and the CIA and the intelligence community, especially if you listen to Chuck Schumer, are essentially doing battle right now. They're not getting along. They're butting heads. Is it possible, or what does Donald Trump do to mend that relationship?
I don't think that if there's supposed to be amending some of the relationships, I think are unfortunately they've degenerated into personal hostility. A lot of the intelligence community outside battlefield intelligence, I think, is superfluous. But this is what I think is the kind of ethos that we need to have in the United States, including the kind of ethos that ought to discuss the topic that you addressed. You know, we should not disrespect opinion. We say we may disagree on policies. That's part of what it means to be America. And we solve them. You go, you take votes. If you lose, you lose. But we should not use inflammatory language. Ultimately, what made us great was we all hung together so we didn't hang separately. What hangs us together is our Declaration of Independence, our belief in process, in the Constitution, the heroism of the Civil War, World War I, World War II. We all have the same values, even if we can disagree on particulars. And we should not view other Americans with suspicion. There's no hyphenated Americans, and we're all in it together. And there's the first way we're going to lose our greatness as a country when we start viewing ourselves as part of separate tribes. No, that wasn't what won, the battle of the Revolutionary War. We had to hang together despite differences, and I think that's critical. We need that to be the ethos. And instead of trying to demonize any opponent, that's not what the United States is about. And we can see, Owen, when you do that, and it's so prevalent in other countries, you just crumble. You end up with civil war and strife, and very little, if anything, happens. And I underscore, it doesn't mean you have to compromise your ultimate decision. You can vote against somebody, but you don't say, well, you're an enemy because you didn't agree with me. I couldn't convince you. Okay, this is how we resolve differences. We have it through a political process. You vote. You don't have the vote, you lose. Fight another day.
But let's say we reach a point, and we've almost kind of reached this point where you've got conflicting stories coming out of the White House or the president's mouth versus what's coming out of the CIA and the intelligence communities. What is the future there? What is the future of the CIA? Does Trump, pun intended, trump the CIA? Or do they continue to try to put out their own intelligence that goes against what Trump is saying?
But listen, the president is still the president of the United States. He has the authority under the Constitution. He can fire anybody for insubordination at that level that he wishes to. I mean, that's vindicated by the U.S. Supreme Court. It's up to the president there to say, you've lost my confidence, I can fire you. And that's, if it comes to that, he's entitled to put his people in. And then he goes to the voters, in 4 years' time or less, and they come back with it. But that's one of the reasons why we have accountability. It's not like, there were proposals, Owen, at the Constitutional Convention to have a plural executive. More than one president said, no, that's not good, because then you can't hold a president accountable if he can't have his own people under him. So President Trump's got to decide. If he doesn't find somebody that he can rely upon, is in the executive branch. And last I saw, the CIA was in the executive branch. It was created by statute in 1947. Appoint somebody different.
So what is stopping Donald Trump from his signature catchphrase, "You're fired"?
I don't have an answer to that question. As a constitutional lawyer, I said he has the power to do it. And if he doesn't, that's his political calculation, I suppose, putting pluses and minuses in it.
Well, let's say that Donald Trump is trying to perhaps in the future have an olive branch available, or he thinks eventually he can work with these people and that's his goal. Do you think that this is something that there might be a timetable on, or what advice would you give to Trump if he just continues to deal with these walls in the CIA or in the executive branch that have no interest at all in working with him?
But remember that supervisors have responsibilities for their underlings. He may not know the particulars. He just says, well, I'm going to appoint my people there. That's why at the outset of the program, I mentioned the importance of having his people aboard. And that's really what should be his undivided attention. That's how this, in my judgment, will disappear on its own. But if he doesn't take that action, it's going to go back to, all right, just fire the people who believe are acting irresponsibly. Got to find replacements. Maybe he doesn't find replacements, and move on. But again, the buck stops in the White House, where it ought to be. It's like the buck stop in Congress. And if he doesn't like what's going on, are the people who he thinks doing wrong, put his own people in. He's accountable for what happens. That's how our system works.
As far as I could tell, there was a lot of obstacles for Obama and his agenda, obviously in Congress. But as far as I could tell, it was all legal. They did it within the government process to try to slow down some of Obama's policy. If we start to see illegal activity, perhaps, illegal wiretapping, et cetera, go on here to try to stop Trump's policy, what legal counsel would you say you would give him in order to try to stop this from deterring his agenda?
Well, if the federal government is committing crimes, they're supposed to prosecute crimes. And there's nothing that prevents the president from deciding he will appoint a special prosecutor. But it goes back, if he believes that his part of the executive branch is committing crimes, they should be fired immediately. He doesn't want to have them in his administration.
Well, Bruce, it sounds to me, just to try to put a cap on all of this, the two big things that I take away from this are, at least what you would like to see Donald Trump do in the future, are one, he has the attention on him. He has the spotlight on him. Use it. Get out in the public, hit the bully pulpit, get your message out there, preach on policy. And then the other thing is, he has the power of government. He has the power of law. Use that to impose his will so that he can get his agenda through in 4 years or 8 years. Is that pretty much a good summary, would you say, of all the things you've covered?
Well, I mean, but it has to go down to the granular level. You have to have real people. As I identified the ones you're not going to get confirmation with an empty chair. You got to be undistracted and go out and find the people and interview them and get them in place. The confirmation process takes time. And the other element, again, that we spoke of that's very important is we've got to get the government smaller. $4.3 trillion. We've got to eliminate these agencies. We got to end these wars that are not making us safe. We're wasting money, making us less safe. We need to have an invincible self-defense back in the United States. He needs to repeat every day, President Trump, you wake up, repeat what you stated at your last joint session address to Congress. You're elected President of the United States, not President of the world. You know, your morning briefing session should be more about Detroit and New York City and Kansas City and Sacramento or Phoenix than it is about Bangkok or Moscow or Beijing or otherwise. That's your first task. These others are secondary unless they relate to how you can make these cities in the United States greater. And that's why, Owen, got to end all this effort to try to police the world with money and force and whatever. Our example alone should be our influence abroad. And people regularly forget that when we were just born as a nation, 227 years ago, and we had no frigates, no military-industrial contact, 3 million, 13 states, we sent trembles throughout Europe and Asia because we pronounced we are a government of the people, we the people, government by the consent of the governed. And these principles were so frightening to the monarchs and the tyrants that they trembled. They put these on censorship lists. You can't read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. Our example has a huge power even without a single weapon. That's our influence abroad. That's what the founders conceived, our influence abroad. You know, no one celebrates tyranny anywhere, but we got to recognize the limits of what we're able to do there. You know, you're not going to transform Iraqis into Canadians by bayonets. Not going to happen. And we need to recognize those limits. It's not because we're callous, but because we know that we can't live in a state of delusion without destroying ourselves. And that's what is critical. I'm President of the United States of America, not the world.
So there you go, folks. Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, wanting to put America first. And let's be very clear. We, the people, have the power in this country, and the people are behind you, President Trump. Well, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. That was very enlightening. Hopefully, President Trump will listen to this. Anything else? Any final words before we let you go?
Yes, I would like to pay tribute to Ron Paul. I think many of the ideas that were present in President Trump's campaign and that were articulated by myself were inspired by Ron Paul's 2012 campaign. I think he really has brought a new vision of restoring the United States to what it's envisioned by the framers was. And he certainly is someone who, at least in the background, is very much part of this debate over returning the United States to its original conception as liberty-centered, not military-centered and not the government-centered universe. And I pay tribute to his great dedication to the United States.
Thank you, Bruce. Excellent point there in the end. And one thing that Ron Paul always talked about was we the people. And again, we the people are behind Donald Trump as long as he keeps putting America first.